Alrighty, sorry about that delay. Welcome back to another thrilling installment of Mecha Mondays. I'm your intrepid narrator, Fragath, and today we're going to be reading more from ManFac by Martin Caidin. Oh, thank you, Toby Frost, for tuning in. This is not relevant to the current stream, but I've just finished Absolution by Jeff Vandermeer, and I'm interested in your thoughts. Also love the Frankenstein reading. Thanks, sending thanks from CH. Cool. Cool. Very cool. See you in the VOD. Yeah, I got through Absolution. I have thoughts. Some of it's hit or miss. If you've read Born specifically at some point, I think it'll be a bit easier to understand the way he's writing in Absolution. I'll talk more about that when we actually get around to reading it, which will be in the near future. Um, the latest would be early next year. Um, I'm planning on expediting making that more relevant. There is something I want to read after Bear v Shark um, as a palate cleanser, but after that, we would get started on that. Um, at least that's the plan. Uh, so some of the ideas, some of the wordplay shenanigans he gets up to in Absolution feels familiar from Born, Borne. Yes, like something is not or is to be born. It is fortunately not as conceptually deranged as Dead Astronauts was, which is to date one of the trickiest books, certainly the trickiest book by him that I've read. Um, that one's just bewildering. I have a fair idea of what's going on in that book, and I'm still confused by it. Whereas there's kind of an expansion of scope in terms of shenanigans that's occurring in Absolution in Area X, which still feels kind of like what was going on in Dead Astronauts. So those feel, I wouldn't say they're like required reading for that, but they help inform sort of what he's coming from, I guess, how he, as an idea person, has changed um, as a writer, the ideas he wants to write about. Um, I have opinions, many of them positive, some of them kind of like, well, I don't know if we had to do this, but um, we'll get there when we get there. I do think it's worth reading. I think it's an entertaining read, but it is kind of bewildering. To everyone who tried to tune in via via Twitch, the last however long, sorry about that. I found out what the problem was. They had placed a temporary suspension of the account because they did not like the cover art that I had for this last stream of the Jesus incident. And it's not unreasonable that they be upset about that. There is a certain degree of nudity on that. But there is something to be said for standing up for yourself when you're reasonably confident that a bot was involved. And when it comes to anything associated with either Amazon or Google, assume a bot was involved first and work your way to the humanity later. Um, in this case, I did just a simple, very short appeal note, which was something along the lines of the image used was cover art from the Orbit edition of the 1979 novel The Jesus Incident by Frank Herbert and Bill Ransom. It is evocative of the Venus de Milo and is not intended in any pornographic capacity. And like less than 12 hours later, they're like, "Oh, sorry, we reviewed it, and okay." So that's what was going on there. Drama. I do try to keep up with that sort of thing. I assumed it was a technical issue, and it was not. Well, it was, but it wasn't. Anyway, previously on ManFac. More than a man, more than a machine. Nothing can withstand the force of ManFac. So previously on, our boy Lance Parker, that's his name? Yes, Lance Parker got back from his 1 week sojourn um, into the wilderness of, well, okay, actual human civilization, which ended with him uh, getting away with his life from a bunch of barroom thugs. He promptly goes back to Lee Grazzi's place, puts on a manfac that looks like a Paul Bunyan or a lumberjack or something, goes back down there, beats the ever-loving bejesus out of them, dips before the cops, well, actually dips as the cops get there, and then um, he and Lee get down to the dirty business of learning more about each other's bodies. And then, of course, learning about the deep, dark, dirty truth, which is Lee Grazzi has been doing this all on her dime for the last couple years, and she is now out of money and needs to go do work stuff. And he's like, "Well, yeah, you should go do that. Why are you even discussing this?" And she's like, "But we've made such progress." And he's like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, just go. Just go." And she's like, "Okay, but like I have to be in San Francisco." And he's like, "Yeah, yeah, 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 yeah. I'll be fine." She's like, "Okay," and then the earthquake hits. Uh, the big earthquake hits, and so buildings are lit on fire. The power grid goes down. He hops into a manfac of a large black dude shaped manfac and saves a bunch of kids. Not all of them. Not all the kids. Like 80% of the kids in a burning school slash convent, nunnery, religious school thing. Anyway, he saves most of the kids, but a bunch of them definitely die. Like, ew, die. Like, ew. Burning alive isn't fun, die. Um, but he saves a bunch of kids, and he's like, well, everybody knows that this giant black dude saved a lot of kids in a burning building. I can never be that person ever again. So he goes back up after getting some help from a local, whose name is Les, I think. Les Seaver, I want to say. Les Seaver, yes. Seaver. Um, he gets a little help from him and winds up going back to Lee Grazzi's place. He tells the guy, "You need to forget you ever saw me. I'm not involved in drugs or anything, but or like gang stuff or any badness. I'm not on the run from the law, but I am. I would rather keep this between you and I, if at all possible. Thank you." So he goes back to Lee Grazzi's place, grabs some of the other manfacs, not the one that looks like him before he became a nuclear accident afflicted cripple. Um, Hides I think it was something Scott Parker maybe, Logan Scott. Logan Scott was the name of the large black dude persona. Um, the brother. He leaves that behind in the ruins of the lab of Lee Grazzi's home slash lab, which I guess insurance is going to cover. They even make a quick little lampshade of that, where he's like, "Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. At least insurance will cover it." Where is it? I'm confident that this got brought up, like right towards the end. Anyway, so he's grabbed Swedish giants. He's grabbed a thick-necked German, and there's another one that he's grabbed, but I don't remember which. I'm pretty sure he has three. Do 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 do. As he predicted, the leveled area was safe from fire. Blah blah blah. Remained little here for Lee to return. Something, something, something. Devastating earthquake. At this moment, the wreckage was isolated. Blah. Telephone lines were down. Here we go. Lee was heavily insured, and while nothing could truly replace what she had assembled painstakingly through the years, at least her financial collapse would now be averted, assuming the insurance companies play ball, and he's already been shafted by insurance companies already. Although he's blamed it on the government instead. So I'm sort of like, maybe. Okay, no need to obey his inner voice. Knocks and dents, surface damage. Here we go. He would not take the ManFac lance. He wanted only his own true identity or totally different ones. His own true identity being the mostly crippled guy body that he finds himself in now. Let's see. Oh, there's a Japanese ManFac that's like built like a jacked sumo wrestler. Um, More jacked sumo wrestler. It's not fat, but it looks like E Honda from Street Fighter, basically, with less face paint. It's a big dude. He's a burly boy. So there's a big Japanese body, a thick-necked German, and a Swedish giant. A bearded Swedish giant. Anyway, those are the bodies he's taken with him, and now he is going off into the sunset as we hit Act 3 of ManFac. Book 3, Chapter 20. He drove at a leisurely pace along the southern route of the country, keeping as much as possible to the interstate highways, where he would always be within easy driving distance for fuel, food, and motels. He was heading for the Ponce de Leon Inlet on the Florida East Coast. It was an isolated beach where people minded their own business, and the fishing was great. It was the perfect place for catching up on himself. He eliminated one worry before his first day was over. The ManFac power system was limited. He kept power packs in the truck cab for emergency use, but he detested the idea of being restricted to limited hours of movement and driving, having to come to a halt when he was dangerously low on guaranteed movement. He shopped in a small-town hardware and auto parts store, ran a power cable from the engine generator into a regulator bolted to the underside of the cab dashboard. Presto! When the engine was running, he had a constant source of regulated electrical current directly into the ManFac. Hooking in or out was a matter of only seconds. It removed the nagging worry of keeping going. He had plenty of other thoughts with which to occupy himself, like what he was going to do with himself. His money supply had its own limits. His money supply had its own limits. He was an engineer, but he had sworn never to use his own credentials. If ever there were a background survey or a security check, his past would leap up like a screaming goblin, and no one was going to keep on a payroll the man who had been pilloried in the media as the son of a bitch mainly responsible for that nuclear blow-up beneath a California mountain. So he had a new ID. Sven Andersson, big and strong and very impressive. And what do you do, Mr. Andersson? Why, I eat electricity. That's for starters. And I'm very strong, and I worked at a laboratory in California, and no, I don't have any credentials or an engineering resume, and I'm sorry, I don't have any professional or personal character references, and the construction crew hiring office is where? That was about as good as pissing up a rope. He wasn't going to be any muscle boy on he wasn't going to be any muscle boy on a road gang or any damned kind of construction. He'd have to start way down on the bottom of the pile, and he'd earn just enough. He'd earn just about enough to feed himself food, gasoline, and electricity, and he could do that for a month or 3 or 6, and when the time was behind him, he'd be nowhere. The merry-go-round wasn't on his trip ticket. When the thinking furrowed his brow and he felt the headaches starting to crawl behind his ears, he quit. Just quit cold. No use building up huge walls. He had ideas. Hordes of them. But there was no way he could settle down and tinker and test and experiment without a big, fat bankroll. That problem would have to be met squarely in the future. File it. He did. He'd open the file when he had to. He danced on wings of imagination, though. He already knew how to improve the ManFac, improve the systems, gain more flexibility. He had crazy ideas. Direct use of force fields. An idea for magnetic or microwave lift came into his thoughts. It would be interesting. He could tie it in with several gyro-stabilizing systems, and he could file it. Yes, sir. There were new problems with much more immediate. There were new problems that were much more immediate to be solved. He'd lived for 2 weeks as Lance Parker, hobbled and needing his cane, and he'd gone through a whole series of widescreen nightmares that were just as real as he'd imagined. That was well behind him. He'd made excursions as a ManFac. Twice, the last occasion as the dark-skinned rescuer of children. Too much notoriety there. He didn't regret his decision to lay Logan Scott to rest. But this was his first voyage into the daily world as a ManFac. Endurance was a new test. He had to maneuver not only on a day-to-day basis, but one day after the other. There were compensations. As a as the crippled Lance Parker, he was horribly vulnerable. But a man would have to be crazy to mess with his formidable bulk and obvious strength as the hulking Sven Andersson. He didn't spend his days looking over his shoulder. It was beautiful. Not so the long hours and the days that sometimes seemed to never end. He drove until he chafed and twisted uncomfortably, and then he stopped the truck and sat amidst trees or on the edge of roadside camps, where you could just look across mountains and desert, and sometimes just look up at the sky, remembering when he had fallen through that same sky with Lee, fallen and balanced and whirled before pulling the D-ring and waiting for the nylon to blossom, and then the quiet, cushioned, gentle float to earth. There was no rush on that rolling eastward trek, and he had just the company he wanted. Himself. The small things in life were a constant challenge, and the acceptance and meeting of each such challenge were a growing list of successes and victories. He ate rarely in restaurants, preferring to pick up his food and drinks and eat in solitude. It went well. The times he had to stop were the killers. And there was no way to escape that harsh reality. After long hours of driving and eating and walking and functioning as a ManFac, he drifted into the ManFac being. Lance Parker and Sven Andersson coalesced into an entity that defied identification. When he looked into a mirror, the mighty face and form of Sven looked back at him, and he was the Swede. Not merely in appearance or in actions, but in subconscious thought and intent as well. But there was no living as Andersson. Every so often the giant Swede had to be put aside. His own biology demanded its due. Rubbed and chafed skin, aching muscles, bleary eyes, the need for oils and ointments to work their effect. It was a rotten, stinking time for him to emerge from the ManFac, always behind doubly locked doors and alarm systems rigged for each room that for a time became a terrible prison and also an eggshell that could be cracked when he was his most vulnerable. Every occasion caused a paranoid shriek of helplessness in his mind. He backed up the extra bolts and bars and security alarms with a repeating shotgun and a .38 revolver. He never went anywhere without the handgun. He slept with it. He kept it by his side when he bathed. It was within instant reach when he sat on the john. Standing to urinate was rough on him. Balancing with one hand on his cane, or leaning against the wall and using a twisted arm to handle himself and his clothing, left him glaringly naked to any intrusion. He never relieved himself standing unless he was Anderson. He felt safer on a toilet seat. No crazy balancing act. His eyes always on the door. The gun always within a split second of his hand. No showers. Too helpless. Baths, because this way he could heat soak. He could soak in oils, and the gun was always on the edge of the tub or on a stool by the tub. He was thinking constantly of his security. The bolts weren't enough. Neither were the alarms. He might be in a deep sleep and someone could come crashing through his defenses, and he had nightmares of a great fist smashing into his scarred face, or a knife slashing at him, and he would jerk awake, soaked in sweat, his eyes darting about like a wild, cornered animal, and he would clasp the shotgun and take the whole goddamn night to come down to coherent thinking. He forced himself to use what he had in abundance: engineering know-how. He rigged an electrified matting that he hung across any motel window and along the floor just inside the doorway. The netting received its charge from both a wall socket and, in case the local power went out, a high-amp 12-volt battery. There was enough juice in that battery to slam a water buffalo against a wall. Any interruption of the electric current snapped on a bright floodlight he always directed toward the windows and door and set off a clanging alarm. It brought him extraordinary relief. No one could ever reach him without running that gauntlet. I think there might be such a thing as being too paranoid. Paranoia eased well back from his immediate thoughts when he sealed himself into motel rooms. It cleared his head for thinking instead of reacting. Yet a man couldn't escape the harsh realities of life in the form of people who liked trouble and actively sought its company. He was driving slowly through a small town in Louisiana, forced to take back roads because of construction blocks on the interstate, when he learned that all the electronic miracles and technical advances could not dismiss certain cardinal sins. Like, don't mess around in the wrong town, meaning simply, don't attract attention. That was pretty tough with the truck and his own brute size. River Keys was an out-of-the-way shitpot of a town that had managed to avoid the attention of modern expansion. No big shopping centers, no new industry for years, no wide-laned highway crowding the town. It was holdout country for rednecks and spoilers, and it was a century in the past, enjoying its privileged position of being able to hate niggers and strangers and get away with it. It was a world of good old boys, to whom whomping strangers was good sport. Lance drove slowly into the town, unbelieving of the ramshackle buildings, the closed gas stations, the proliferation of small bars on each side of the one street through River Keys. He was beat, his skin chafed in several places, and he needed desperately to return to Lance, no matter how appalling the thought of emerging from the form of the powerful Swede. He pulled into the driveway of the Rivertown Motel, parked and locked the truck, and went into the lobby to register for a room. A pockmarked face with stubble and buck teeth met him across the greasy motel counter. If the rooms are like him, Lance thought, I won't be here more than time enough to bathe and get some oil on my skin. What can I do for you? He could hardly understand the drawl. He tried his best to ignore it. A room, Lance said, towering over the Adam's apple bobbing beneath the protruding teeth. A room with a bath. Tobacco juice spattered on the floor. Can't help you none, he was told. Lance's eyes narrowed. He could feel the wrong about all this. If he had the first ounce of sense, he'd be back in that truck and on his way, but you got a vacancy sign outside. Don't matter. Ain't got no baths here. You want a shower? The pockmarked face twisted into a high giggle. You smells like you needs one, that's for sure. Lance looked coldly at the clerk. The sense of wrong was stronger than ever. What the hell would make this beanpole so cocksure of himself that he'd deliberately taunt someone of the size of Sven Anderson? He had his answer when two dark-faced men came into the lobby through a side entrance. You got some problem with this stranger, Luke? One asked. Luke nodded vigorously. He like to tell me we ain't good enough for him. Ain't got no bath. He needs one. Told him he ought to shower the way he smell. Maybe it's his beard being blonde and pretty and girly like. Jesus Christ. That's Lance saying that, not just me. Lance took a deep breath. Shove your shower up your ass, he said quietly, turning to leave. Two more big bastards, one with a chain hanging from a dirty fist. You gotta apologize to Luke, sonny, said the chain handler. You a big motherfucker, all right, but you done hurt his feelings. Now apologize to him. Lance glanced to his side, and sure enough, the other two were moving closer, and Luke was grinning hugely, a baseball bat appearing in one hand. You should have stayed on the interstate, boy, and not come messing around and insulting good people. Lance backed up to a wall, already knowing what he was going to do. He faced 5 men, about 15 feet to the doorway leading to the truck. He nodded. I suppose I was wrong, he said. Jaws dropped. Good. I mean, what the hell? No harm intended. Luke, you got my apology, just like your friends want. Why, the yellow-livered polecat is sucking. Lance came forward with unbelievable speed and fury, leaning forward into his run, catching the man with the chain along the bridge of his nose with his knuckles held tightly together and protruding. Even over the sudden thunder of his feet slamming onto the floor, they could hear the terrible cracking sound as the bones splintered and blood sprayed out. Lance didn't hesitate as he continued. I just lost my place because I might have just had a network hiccup. Sorry. Lance didn't hesitate as he continued. The second man caught a tremendous backhand that hurled him off his feet and through the wall to his side. Lance threw himself into the run and did just what the remaining 2 men would never expect. 6 feet from them, he hurled that massive body through the air, hands outstretched with his fingers in great claws. His left hand caught one man by the shoulder and spun him about, but the other was a dead-on catch, with Lance's right hand squeezing about his face along his temples. And he squeezed with force enough to break wood. The skin split, and the bone beneath shattered, and the scream told Lance he could ignore this son of a bitch. He felt as much as heard the feet behind him. He spun off to his right, turning as he did so, and caught a glimpse of Luke's enraged face as he swung wildly with the heavy bat. Lance went forward, beneath that stupid swing, and did no more than to plant a great fist solidly into the ribs beneath that still upraised arm. Luke never made a sound, and Lance knew he'd done more damage than he planned, for his fist not only punched into ribs, but went on through the rib cage. A chair crashed over his head. Damn, these were tough bastards. The man he'd spun around moved like a big cat, and had already grabbed a chair and slammed it across Lance's head and shoulders. Wood cracked, but Lance stood his ground and came upright slowly, then pointed a finger at his attacker. You ever do that again and I find out about it, I'll bust your head. Understand? The remains of the chair dropped to the floor, and his assailant took off at a dead run, tearing away a door hinge as he hit dirt outside and kept running. Lance had no time to enjoy amusement. These towns stuck together, and he was a sudden challenge, and if they ever got their act together, he'd be in trouble up to his ears. He went swiftly to the motel desk and ripped out the telephone wires. Then he ran outside to the main power line. He went up the pole, hauling himself along the metal rungs as if he were weightless. He braced himself, and then the ManFac arm came down in a great sweeping arc with all his strength. No danger from the lines, the plastiskin was non-conducting. But sparks showered out wildly, and a great greenish light flared, and the town fell into blackness. The only lights to penetrate the sudden dark came from the headlights of cars cruising through town. Out of sight of anyone who might be seeking the loss of power, Lance dropped back to the ground. 4 cars, that was all. One hand ripped open the hoods, and the other hand tore away the electrical wires, and Lance was running for his truck. He unlocked the door, started the engine, leaving his lights off. There was still that one polecat who'd run from the motel, and it was time for Sven Anderson to haul ass away from this snake pit. He slammed the truck into gear, spinning rubber as he fishtailed wildly until the tires grabbed asphalt. And just in time. He heard the shotgun blasts fired through the darkness as he accelerated along the highway. Someone shouted obscenities as the dark mass of the truck bore down on him, and he jumped aside with only inches to spare. Lance grinned and then turned on his lights. He hit 80, screeched to a crawl at the first intersection, drove several miles on the back roads, and picked up an interstate going north. He drove the legal limit for the next 2 hours and then eased off the interstate to follow signs leading to an all-night truckers' stop. There was safety in numbers in the long rows of heavy rigs. 20 minutes later, he was within his motel room, doors and windows locked, his electrical defenses alive and humming. He filled the tub, poured in body oil, rested the shotgun on a table alongside the tub, and slid gratefully into the soothing water. He afforded himself the luxury of a cigar. He looked vacantly at the smoke, his thoughts far away, and then a wry grin came slowly to his face. It had been one hell of an education. Chapter 21. Shigura Sato drove steadily at 50 miles an hour along the wide highway leading to Atlanta, and he made certain never to exceed the speed limit. The big Japanese sat easily behind the wheel of his truck, eating a hero sandwich with obvious pleasure and sipping from a thermos of steaming coffee. Wherever he stopped for fuel and oil, he drew curious stares. A 6-foot Japanese with a shaved skull and massive arms isn't your everyday neighbor on the highway. He remained at each stop just long enough to service his truck and use the men's room, and he was gone. Lance chuckled. He'd been a bit absent-minded the first time he walked into the men's room. The hulking Japanese looking back at him from the mirror startled him. For a split second he looked frantically for the face of Sven Anderson, and then the cobwebs vanished. Sven was secured within the truck, along with his lifeless German companion. The need for the fast change before Lance left the truck stop hadn't been so funny. He hadn't planned to shift to another man, until he watched the early morning television news. According to still somewhat confused reports, the small town of River Keys had been the scene of an invasion of biker hoodlums led by a bearded giant. No one knew just how many bikers were involved, but a motel clerk had been critically hurt from a kick in the ribs that punctured his lungs. Ugh. Another man had been stomped in the face and was in a nearby hospital. There was more, but Lance leaned back in his chair, ignoring the details. He, of course, had been the gang. Those swamp yokels weren't about to admit to anyone that just one man had wreaked such carnage. But it posed a serious problem spelled "All Points Bulletin," with descriptions of the large man with the blond beard sent to all law enforcement agencies on a dangerous fugitive charge. Lance waited until no one paid attention to the parking lot, walked casually to the truck, and disappeared inside as Sven Anderson. When the truck drove off, Shigura Sato was behind the wheel. Lee Grazzi had been right. He was the man who could be anybody. I think this isn't like a pickup truck. I think this is like an 18-wheeler or a larger box truck. So my brain has been thinking the wrong thing, I believe. So it must, or maybe a U-Haul truck equivalent, box vehicle sort of thing. His ease of slipping into the physical shell of another man didn't blind him to harsh realities. Until the time came that he could live uninterrupted within a ManFac for a week at the very least, he was still a Cinderella prisoner. Would return to being the pumpkin with dragging foot and twisted body and eye-catching scars. What would he do if he were arrested? A night in the slammer would expose who and what he was and draw incredible attention to him, and if there was any defense more vital than anonymity, he couldn't think of it. If a situation arose where a cop wanted to play rough, Lance feared he'd have no choice but to play even rougher. He would have to, he absolutely must, prevent coming under the control of any agency or individual that restricted his movement. He would play it clean, and he would play it straight unless his own survival dictated otherwise, and survival was spelled out, among other things, as having his multiple identities remain unidentified. Well, he sighed, all this was fine as to sorting out future modes of personal conduct, but it did damned little to settle that other nagging problem. The tough four-letter word spelled cash. Cash on the line. He couldn't live indefinitely off Lee's credit cards, and he didn't want to, because that signified to him that if nothing else, his financial umbilical was still intact, and he was still sucking on the fiscal teat. More than that, the continued use of such cards meant a warm trail, and if he was going to be fair to Lee, he had to cut that cord, leave himself isolated from any contact. I don't see why that's fair to Lee. But okay. I mean, using her credit cards, that's fair. Not using those is fair. But completely separating yourself from her seems, I don't know. Anyway, the question that loomed phantom-like before his mind's eye remained. How was he going to perform that little miracle of making his way through life without that dependency upon the credit rating of Lee? He didn't like some of the alternatives. ManFac was a most effective instrument for strong-arm tactics. One blow of his hand could smash through a wall or crush a man's head. Was he going to embark on mugging to earn his keep? Rob stores? Use that strength to break into jewelry stores or whatever? Dillinger was hardly his hero, and the whole idea of living that way, spurred on by a bitterness he knew he had whipped, repelled him. He turned off the convoluted thinking, for he could handle it only for a short period at a time. Driving was his solace right now, the freedom of rolling along, of becoming comfortable within the ManFac, rather than simply extending the time he could bear the problems of disappearing within this outer husk of his new being, was tonic to him. He could hardly believe 8 days of driving were behind him, but the highway signs announcing Atlanta were not to be denied. Let's see. 8 days is reasonable. You can definitely do cross country in 8 days. You can do it in less if you really want to pound your brain into jelly. But 8 days seems pretty reasonable to go from California to Atlanta, Georgia. He rolled off a ramp leading to a small airport and industrial park on the outskirts of the city. The motels in such areas catered to workers, salesmen, and essentially a professional crowd rather than tourists, and that kind of crowd was more prone to mind its own business. To them, motels were like fast food restaurants that kept a man's profile acceptably low. He drove slowly past the lights of the airport pilots, called Charlie Brown Airport, and then yeah, it says airport pilots. Okay. He drove slowly past the lights of the airport pilots, called Charlie Brown Airport, and then his foot came slowly to the brake as a garishly illuminated building caught his eye. He eased off the road and shifted into neutral. A great neon sign blazed at him. DeKalb Sports Arena. Wrestling tonight. He studied the building, the parking lot, the entrance. Jammed. Thousands of people making the scene. Thousands of people means several times that amount in dollars. And the television receipts. The grunt and groan circuit with its hysterical, loyal, crazy fans. He knew wrestling well enough. On his collegiate team, he'd won the Gold Cup and been a serious contender in his weight class for the Olympics. But that kind of mat competition had little to do with the deliberate mayhem of professional wrestling. Making it big in the squared circle meant a lot of money. Some of the biggest names raked in a few $100,000 a year and left behind them a trail of broken bones, torn skin, and battered opponents. There was that fine line. When you were good enough to cross it, which meant when you drew enormous crowds and swelled the gate receipts, you were allowed to beat the other guy senseless. A key to the game was physiological. Lance had known some very big, very powerful men from the football ranks who'd climbed into the professional wrestling game and had the absolute bejesus smashed out of them. What you needed in this business was a natural ability to absorb punishment. If you had that, you might be in. But you still had to come up the long and slow route. You had to meet the private rules in the back offices, and everything was ritualized. You played by the rules, or you were liable, one night, to find a spoiler in the ring with you. The spoilers were nasty, tough men with one purpose: to teach errant wrestlers the wisdom of playing the game the way the management called the shots. And there were grudge matches, which the management also held dear to its fiscal heart. If two men were determined to tear each other apart, the ring, not the dressing room, was the place to hammer at each other. That kind of match, especially between the real pros, even brought the other wrestlers out of the dressing rooms to watch. It was one of the few occasions when the hype was absent from the ring, and one of the two men squaring off was likely to end up in a hospital bed. Lance drove slowly past the entrance, watching the long lines of people. The card tonight in this arena, which seated some 8,000 people, featured 8 matches. The openers didn't matter. Lance studied the poster. A winner-take-all contest. Likely it was hype to increase the frenzied fever of the fans, but that was unimportant. Igor Belenkov, billed as the Mad Russian, up against Big Jim Swigert. Swigert? Swigert. Swigert. I don't know. Swigert. Sviger? Big Jim Swigert, who did his wrestling in logging boots. There was some other nonsense about the Southeast Television Championship on the line. He ignored that. The matches started at 8 that night, and the main event would get underway at 10. Wonder what ManFac could do in that ring. He was startled with the clarity of that inner voice of his. But what if he could pit his strength, abetted by his collegiate wrestling background, against the best the promoters had to offer? He needed time to think this through, to get past the problem of coming out of nowhere. You didn't just walk into the promoter's office and get a top match. The rungs had to be climbed one by one. He didn't have that kind of time. Not in a business as tightly controlled as IBM. He needed an approach absolutely different, unexpected, something that would blow the minds of the fanatical devotees of this orchestrated mayhem. Because if they demanded you in the ring, they showed their zeal in lining up at the ticket windows, and that opened the door to the promoter's office. Lance rubbed his hand against his chin in an old reflex. If he hurried, he could register at a motel and still get to one of the big department stores that sold athletic equipment. So you kind of know where this is going. Mentioned this is kind of goofy superhero adjacent wish fulfillment stuff, power fantasy stuff, and this is definitely where it's there.
If this seems at all familiar to you, perhaps you are aware of the origin story of one Spider-Man.
With less powered armor. Shigura Sato stood in the lobby of the arena, the subject of close attention by security guards and onlookers. He watched through the open doors as the two wrestlers climbed through the ropes into the ring. Perfect. Igor Belenkov, the Mad Russian, was probably born and raised in Brooklyn, but he displayed beautiful showmanship in his fleece-lined boots and brilliant red cape. He strutted about the ring as Big Jim Swigert, I still don't know how that's pronounced, Swigert, leaned against the ropes in his corner, preferring a style of brooding nastiness. The referee was going through his own ritual of instructing the two men as to the rules of the ring, an accepted con act for the crowd. Shigura Sato, wearing black boots and black tights and a black karate robe with a bright band tied about his forehead, started down the aisle. A security guard blocked his way. "Hey, you can't go down there. You ain't got no ticket." Sato smiled coldly and kicked the guard in the knee. The guard yelped in pain and spun about to crash into a row of spectators. Heads turned at the sudden yell, and thousands of people watched the huge Japanese stalk menacingly toward the ring. Two more guards stepped before him and were smacked aside by open slaps that sent them flying off balance. Before the astonished wrestlers could move, Sato was in the ring. The referee grabbed his arm, leaned up to speak into his ear.
"I don't know who the hell you are, but get out of here."
Sato smiled at him. Play the game, asshole. Who do you think sent me here? The referee, puzzled, looked at the other men. Who was this Jap? He was too clean. Not a mark on him. No scars, no twisted nose or puffy ears. Not a welt or a bump. Sato pointed a thick finger at Swigert and in broken English said, I want you. Other man, go away before you hurt. The referee danced about like a bantam rooster, grasping Sato's arm and shouting for him to leave the ring at once. He was flung aside contemptuously, and the finger still pointed at Swigert, and this time the voice could be heard throughout the hushed, still confused spectators. I want you! Now! Swigert smiled. He'd been through every ploy in the book. Okay, you got me. He leaned back against the ropes. But first you gotta get rid of him, he said, pointing to Belenkov. Sato bowed. Arigato. I appreciate. He turned to Belenkov. You pleased to leave ring, maybe? You crazy bastard, Belenkov snarled. Get the hell out of here. Too bad, Sato said. You come into ring with laces untied. Not smart. See? He pointed to Belenkov's right foot. Belenkov glanced down, and he never saw the great hand that came up in a blur to chop him with devastating force in the throat. He staggered back, blood trickling from his throat, and he had no time to protect himself as a hand gripped his hair, jerked him forward off balance. A kick to the ribs, and before Belenkov could react, he was flung through the ring ropes to crash in face-contorted agony on the concrete floor. He looked up in mingled pain and astonishment, judged a hasty retreat to be long overdue, and limped back to the dressing room. The other wrestlers, who had watched the unexpected turn of events on the closed-circuit television screen, surrounded him with a babble of voices. Hey, Igor, what the hell kind of gimmick you guys pulling? One man shouted. Another pushed his way closer to where Belenkov sagged against a dressing table. What's that asshole promoter Rollins pulling off now? He stared at Belenkov. Hey, you really got hurt up there, didn't you? Belenkov nodded, trying to speak, but another wrestler pushed forward. Who is that gook son of a bitch in the ring? I never seen him before. He looked around at the others. Anybody ever get a look at that Jap? The others shook their heads. You dumb bastards! They turned to Belenkov as he spit blood on the floor. I told you he busted a couple of ribs. I think he crushed something in my throat. Will you assholes get me a doctor or an ambulance or something? A youngster patted his shoulder. I'll get the doc, Igor. Just hang on. He ran for the phone. Then they heard the renewed roar of the crowd as another wrestler turned up the volume of the TV monitor. They saw the referee shoving both men apart, gesturing wildly and shouting for them to stand off until the bell. One wrestler pointed to the screen and shook his head. Whoever that Jap is, he don't know Swigert too well. Yeah, didn't he kill a whole bunch of people with his bare hands in Vietnam? You got it. He loved it that way. He used to wring necks until he broke 'em. He'll kill that crazy Jap. Swigert won't play the rules. A finger pointed at the referee. Look at Julius. Son of a bitch is like a bantam rooster. He'll milk this for everything it's worth. Igor Belenkov sat gingerly on the dressing table, wiping blood from his mouth. I don't know. I've never been hit like that before. But what I can't figure out is where Mike Rollins got this ape and how he kept him under wraps for so long. Rollins knows how to make it a circus, all right, another man agreed. He's the best promoter in the game. Mike Rollins burst into the dressing room, pointed at his cigar at the television screen. Who the hell is that son of a bitch? He shouted. The crowd was screaming wild. The arena reverberated from the pressure of thousands of voices, of feet stomping the floor and banging chairs, of shrill whistles.
Never had a wrestler come into the ring without some warning, if not to his opponent, at least to the referee. And the way he'd put Belenkov into the pits, my God, he had power. But Swigert weighed 280 pounds, and he was known as the fastest big man in the ring, and he went low and kept his arms swept forward, catching Sato just behind the knees, sweeping his feet out from beneath him, and by the time the Jap was flat on his ass, Swigert was back on his feet and moving in. He grabbed hair and jerked the other man up, keeping him unbalanced, and Swigert, with every ounce of his strength, slammed his knee into the back of the neck before him. Steel mesh skull or not, Lance saw bright red when the knee crashed into him. He'd never expected this. Not this speed or this strength or the smart ring-wise thinking behind Swigert's move. Sato twisted away. His stiff fingers shot up into Swigert's armpit, forcing Swigert to release his grip on Sato's hair. Sato, Lance, came in fast with a mighty punch to the rib cage. It would have worked except that Swigert was the old pro and twisted with the punch. It gave him that precious moment to shift tactics and to do some good wrestling. An elbow smash under the chin stopped the Jap. Swigert twisted, and a snapmare brought the Jap high over his head for a solid crash to the canvas. Dust flew from the impact. Swigert dropped like a boulder with one knee into Sato's forehead and the other across his throat. He kept going down, lying like a stone blanket across the Jap, holding one wrist flat, his hand on the throat, and his legs hooking him down. "Count him!" he roared to the referee. Yeah, they are going to keep saying Jap, which I'm sorry about, but this was written in a different cultural context. The narrator neither promotes nor... Never mind. You get me. I don't think it's a good idea to say that, but hey. Sato heard two sharp slaps on the canvas. Astonished at his own ineptitude, he took the only way out and rammed his one free arm upward with all his strength into Swigert's chest. Swigert flew wildly up and off to one side, and Sato had his shoulder off the mat even as the referee's hand was coming down for the third and final time. Swigert, on his feet, realized that something was very wrong in here. No human being could do that. Not with one arm. He'd faced champion weightlifters. This was crazy. He wouldn't try to pin this bastard unless he was unable to stand. He watched Sato come to his feet and then charged, head down, into the Jap's gut to shove him backward into the ropes. As he rebounded, Swigert went forward, and his powerful arms encircled the Jap in the killer bear hug for which he was famous. He locked his enormous hands tight with knuckles jammed hard into the spine of his opponent, holding him off the mat, feet dangling in the air. But he could hardly lift this man. No matter. He gave it everything he had, twisting the Jap wildly from side to side to empty his lungs and bring excruciating pain to his spine. Lance didn't fight it. He let go. He let all his body weight slump. He became a 320-pound sack of loose sand. Swigert's legs wobbled. Lance laughed and pushed forward with his stomach muscles. Swigert felt his hands losing their grip. Enraged, he spit into the other man's face. The Jap smiled at him. "You baka! Very stupid man!" he said, and a right hand came up, when it should have been dangling helplessly, and grasped Swigert's left ear. Slowly, deliberately, and with relentlessly increasing pressure, the Jap began to twist the ear. Swigert strained with all his might to crack the other man's spine. Sweat burst from his face as he exerted all his strength, and the son of a bitch smiled at him. He tightened the pressure to break the grip on his ear, but suddenly the pain was intense, and a knife seemed to be stuck into the ear. Blood trickled where the skin began to tear. "You let go, I stop," the Jap told him. "I'll kill you." "Too bad." The Jap smiled, and a steel vise lacerated the ear. Swigert yelled in pain, and his hands flew to his ear as the Jap walked away, still holding the ear. Swigert following helplessly, the pain white and maddening. The terrible pressure had brought him bending forward when a mighty foot thudded into his chest, just over his heart. The next moment he felt himself going high into the air, and then there was a sudden drop into a steel knee. The grinning Japanese stood over Swigert, one foot on his throat, and he pointed to his helpless opponent. A voice thundered above the roar of even this crazed, screaming mob. "You count full! All 10!" Julius Goldsborough intoned the count through 10. The Japanese stepped back, bowed ceremoniously to him, picked up his karate robe, jumped to the floor, and ran ponderously toward the nearest exit. He brushed aside spectators and astonished police, hurled the exit doors open, and disappeared into the night. Chapter 22. Lance waited until 3 o'clock the next afternoon before calling Mike Rawlins. As he expected, he had a tough time getting through. Rawlins' office was a madhouse, and until Lance told the secretary that he managed the havoc-wreaking Japanese, he was getting nowhere fast. Then Rawlins was on the line. "Who the hell is this?" he barked. "The name is Parker, Lance Parker, but the name you're interested in is Shiguro Sato. He's my boy who cleaned your house last night." Lance waited for the pause he knew would come, because Rawlins had to talk to him. The newspapers normally paid as much attention to pro wrestling as to a dead cat in a storm drain. Yikes! But they'd been piqued by what had happened. There was no doubt 2 men had been hurt seriously. Belenkov had suffered a crushed windpipe and 3 broken ribs. He had a lung filling with fluid and was on 24-hour watch. Swigert showed signs of heart fibrillation. It had taken 43 stitches to sew back that part of his ear torn free, and his small fractures filled a page. Hundreds of hysterical fans had called the newspapers and television stations, and something was bound to emerge from that kind of fever. It did. It made only a small paragraph in the sports news, but other news was light, and the TV cameras had rolled into the hospital room. The story kept getting bigger all the time. "You son of a bitch!" Rawlins shouted on the phone to Parker. "You know what I had to do? I had to take a goddamn polygraph test for the Wrestling Commission to prove that wasn't any setup last night. The bastards thought I was lying to them." "You have the press there?" "Huh? Well, yeah, but—" "No buts, Rawlins. That's 100 grand worth of publicity, and we both know it." "What was your name again?" "Same as it was before. Lance Parker. And don't play cute with me. I have something we both can use." "You're pretty sure of yourself." "Cut the shit, Rawlins. I want to talk a deal and talk it face to face, and we do it today, and my boy is back in the ring tonight. That gives you time to hype up the television and radio with special ad announcements. Hell, you know the routine better than anyone else. I can hear the dollar signs clicking in your eyeballs right now. Tell me we have an appointment in 30 minutes in your office, or shove your phone up your ass." The pause was brief. "You got it. 30 minutes." The phone went dead. Lance Parker drove the rental car to Rawlins' office. Not Sven Anderson or Shiguro Sato or Otto Heller, the name he'd decided on for the brutish German yet to be brought to life. Lance Parker, limping his way down the corridor into the outer office, smiling with scarred face and lips at the secretary. She didn't blink an eyelash. Her world was filled with faces punched and kicked to hamburger. Now, I'm not sure if he's using the voice modulator or not. I'm assuming he is. But they're not mentioning whether or not he is. "I'm expected," Lance said pleasantly. Mr. Parker? Yes, sir, you certainly are, she told him, leading him through the next door. Rawlins' eyes widened as the twisted body moved into his office and sought out a comfortable chair.
You're Parker,
He said. You win the cigar?
no unkindness meant, Parker, but your shoulders and other things about you talk. What the hell happened?
A mountain fell on me.
I can believe it. Maybe we'll talk about it over a beer some night. What about now?
Lance shrugged. We're businessmen. The longer we talk before agreeing, the more time you lose with your publicity. And the more of that you lose, the more bread you lose at the gate and for the television circuit.
I'm listening.
Good. Lance hesitated deliberately to light a slim cigar. Last night was free, he said.
Wonderful. Marvelous. You put two of my best boys in the hospital and you tell me it's free. What's your next offer? Cancer?
You're a funny man, Rawlins. Tonight you can jack up the ante and whatever else you want. What I want is $5,000, cash on the line, as soon as the match is over. Not even a cashier's check. 5 thou in century notes, and you hand it to my boy.
What's his name?
Shigura Sato.
Never heard of the bum.
He has excellent references. Go to room 229 in your local hospital. Let's not crap around. Do we dance?
We might. I got conditions. Your boy has to win. He don't win, you don't get a wooden nickel.
Fine. Just have the cash ready for him.
Only if I get my money's worth, Parker. That's a lot of green for one man.
All I lose is one night of my boy having fun, Lance said casually. This conversation is being taped and broadcast to a recorder outside this building, so hear me good. You rent that arena for the rest of the week. Sato will fight anybody you got. He wins, he gets paid at the end of the match. He don't win, you got yourself a freebie. You can hype this thing to complete hysteria. We get 5 thou a night. If it's a deal, Sato will be there at 10 sharp. Rawlins shook his head.
You gotta come to the dressing room ahead of time. The commission insists on...
Buy them television sets, for Christ's sake. No dressing rooms. We keep everybody off balance that way. Rawlins chewed his lip, then nodded.
Deal. Where can I reach you if I need you? You just may have to take your boy home in a hearse.
My problem, not yours, Lance said. I'll call you each day at noon sharp. He climbed painfully to his feet. Play it clean, Rawlins. Don't fuck up a good payday. He left the office. He handled everything with the precision of a well-drilled team. He'd rented space in a large garage with attendants for the truck rather than leave it parked in the motel lot. He used a rental car, changed motels each day. No way for someone to get a really good tag on him. He preferred to remain identified but not known. Rawlins wouldn't sit quietly for too long when Shigura Sato, I can't talk today. Rawlins wouldn't sit quietly for too long when Shigura Sato ate his wrestlers alive, and neither would the other men facing him in the ring. Lance thought about that some more, registered and paid in advance at 3 different motels, and kept one extra rental car stashed in the lot of one motel. Now he had flexibility. Now he could dodge and twist if that became necessary. When he was ready for his appearance at the sports arena, he'd leave directly from the garage. No one would pay any attention to that. No, he corrected himself, there's a better way. Take no chances on anything's pointing to that truck. What it held was his whole life. Later that day, he drove a rental car into the 6-story parking garage. He left the car and slipped into the truck. 20 minutes later, he was again Shigura Sato, clad in a sweatsuit. He drove from the garage and took the main drive to 4 blocks from the armory, where he parked in the back lot of a motel. He sat and watched the car clock. At 9:45 p.m., he slipped the keys onto the mat of the back of the car, climbed out, and started jogging toward the armory. He arrived at 3 minutes before 10 o'clock. This time, the lobby guard stepped back from him. He pulled off the sweatsuit shirt and baggy trousers, placed them carefully on a seat. "Don't let no one touch," he ordered the nearest guard.
Yes, sir.
He stomped his way down the aisle. Not walked or ran, but stomped, more than 300 pounds crashing like muted thunder against the floor. Halfway down the aisle, every eye upon him, he stopped, extended both arms wide, threw back his head, and bellowed, "Banzai! Banzai!" His voice carried like a massive foghorn through the arena, and then he grinned and waved at the crowd, and they answered his call, this almond-eyed stranger who was chewing up their most detested ring villains. The crowd built into a thunder, a monster surf rolling over everyone and everything, a chant increased by a rhythmic pounding of feet. Sato urged them on, his arms rising and falling as he walked ponderously, until it seemed the very walls of the building were trembling with the outpouring of mob sound. Just before the ring, he stopped and turned to the spectators, holding up both hands for silence. He was a maestro leading a human orchestra. Silence fell. In an unabashed exhibition of pure hype, the big Japanese beat his fists against his chest and roared in Tarzan fashion. Normally, his voice would have carried just loud enough to be heard through the arena. The ManFac system magnified it to a blood-curdling cry that echoed and bounced off the walls and ceiling, that turned people white with shock and no small fear at this animal in their midst. It was a beautiful move, and it earned for Shigura Sato a tremendous kick to the side of his head, delivered by none other than the Montana Kid, 340 pounds of meanness packed into a hefty frame of 6 feet 10 inches. Shigura Sato spun about wildly, his arms askew, spinning in a lazy circle. Behind the Japanese face, Lance was dazed by the force of the blow. His ears rang with the sudden pressure that had slammed through the steel mesh and plastiskin layers before the impact thudded into his own head. Before he could catch his balance, he fell backward, and the alarm bells clanging away madly between his ears kept him rolling, kept him moving as his body bruised and pummeled screaming spectators. He caught a blur of the huge wrestler leaping the ropes, and he was just to his feet as a folding chair came walloping toward his head. A raised forearm deflected the blow. The Montana Kid hurled away the splintered wood in his hands, grasped hair, and jerked Sato into a grueling side headlock. Both men crashed to the floor. Sato prepared to break the hold when he heard a voice in his ear.
You bust out of this hold, okay? Then get in her goddamn ring where the TV can see us, okay? Make your move now.
You're damned right I will, Lance swore to himself. But for a split second he had to admire the other man. Montana had smarts between those pulped ears. Rolling around on the concrete floor kept the view limited and the television useless. Sato twisted for leverage, yanked a great hairy leg up from the floor, and sank his teeth hard into muscle. Montana howled like a mad dog, and there wasn't any act to that sudden uproar as blood flowed from the torn skin. The headlock was gone, and Sato crashed a forearm smash to Montana's chest to throw him backward. Sato hit the ring, rolled under the ropes, and was on his feet like a great cat, standing ring center and gesturing wildly for the other man to come in and fight. The scream of the crowd was maniacal. The struggle went for an endless 12 minutes, and Sato didn't spend one moment carrying his opponent. The Montana Kid had been told to wipe off this unknown gook. He tried. He tried with every trick he'd learned in 8 years of bloody fighting, and Sato soon learned why the fight kept on despite the battering he was delivering to Montana. The son of a bitch hardly felt pain. He was bleeding from the bite on his leg and from where terrible punches had split open the skin on his forehead and his nose, and had a smashed lip, and still he grinned and fought. Jesus, this had to end. Sato got a wrist lock, spun the arm, and twisted around and went high into the air, coming down in a devastating armbar. There was no bend left in the arm, and they both heard it break. Montana roared with the pain. Sato measured himself and broke Montana's nose. The blood choked him, stopped his breathing. He gagged for air, and their eyes met, and they shared the unspoken agreement for Sato not to punish that broken arm any more. Sato did the job as mercifully as he could. A handful of hair to jerk the other man off balance, and a crashing fist to the side of the head. Montana fell unconscious. Sato climbed to his feet, again spattered with blood, and he walked about the ring slowly, holding up both arms in a visible signal of victory. He gestured for silence. He was magnetic, majestic, a great fighting pit bull standing on two legs. "I fight anybody!" he bellowed. "Anybody!" He went through the ropes and walked up to a shocked Mike Rawlins. He towered over him, his body streaming sweat and blood and literally steaming. The package was extended slowly, and he took it, bowed slightly, and began running slowly, faster and faster, his head lowered, away from where he'd left his sweatsuit. He smashed through closed exit doors as if they were paper, and kept running, disappearing in the darkness, twisting and turning and taking a circuitous route to the waiting car. He yanked open the back door, grabbed the keys, went in behind the driver's seat, and was gone in a blur of smoking tires. 2 hours later, car changes and shifts behind him, he pulled up to another motel. Lance Parker climbed out stiffly, limping more than usual, and disappeared into his room. The electrified security and alarm system was already set up. Lance brought the shotgun into the bathroom and started his tub. Waiting for the water to fill the tub, he sank into an armchair and opened the package from Rawlins. His face went rigid. $2,000. Lance felt his jaw tighten as he opened a scrawled note.
If you take Montana tonight, then tomorrow night you get $8,000. Fair's fair. Call me at noon sharp.
Lance had no intention of waiting until the next day. He picked up the phone.
I figured I could count on your call,
Rawlins told him. "I figured you wrong," Lance countered, "especially for a Welsher."
That's bullshit, Parker. We both gotta protect our asses. You got the 8 thou locked up for tomorrow night. If you don't believe me, all you gotta do is check the papers tomorrow. Full-page ads. The works, and we doubled the price for the seats, and already we're sold out every night the next 4 nights. So it's a two-way street. I got your $8,000, and you got me by the shorts if you don't show.
A pregnant pause followed, and Rawlins rushed to fill the gap.
Your boy is gonna show, ain't he?
"I'm not so sure I can count on your word, Rawlins."
Jesus Christ, Parker, look at the fucking facts.
Rawlins was shouting into the phone.
We're adding another 1,000 seats in the damn arena, and 9,000 screaming assholes will be out there paying double for their tickets. We even got prime time for that boob tube. You were right. The mystery Jap pulls 'em in, but just so long as he keeps winning, understand? So why should I crap you? You ain't no dummy. 2 and 2 is 4. So it's a deal, right?
Lance dealt a new hand. "You can raise your prices again. Tomorrow night we play doubles. That's why I'm calling you tonight. You have time to change the newspaper and television promotion."
Doubles?
"Uh-huh. You pay me 3,000 you still owe me, and 10,000 for tomorrow night's work."
You creep. I wondered when you'd jack up the ante.
Rawlins said scathingly.
We made a deal, remember? 5 thou and...
"Jesus, just listen. I don't break deals." Lance said coldly. You advertise that Sato will be taking on 2 men and all by his lonesome. He'll...
That's old hat, Parker. You got one good man in a tag team match. What's the big deal? All he has to do is wax one of my people, and he's standing there with his big paw out for 10 grand. No way. We stick to the rules we made.
There's an old saw, Rollins. Engage brain before putting mouth in motion. Will you just shut up and listen?
Okay, I'm listening.
Sato takes on both men at the same time. He's got to beat them both. He has to be the only man standing when it's over. A pregnant pause followed his words.
Even you, Parker, know better than that, Rollins said slowly. I bring in some tough people. Your boy may get killed.
One way to find out, Lance said quietly.
You're serious?
I am. So let's fish or cut bait. Do we have a match tomorrow night? 2 men in the ring against Sato and 13,000 on the line.
Okay, it's on.
2 more things. There will be guards with Sato, bonded. You be sure to make the payment like before, and no fun and games, or they'll arrest you on the spot.
Are you threatening me, you son of a bitch?
No, I want you to keep one thing in your head. There's a fortune out there if we play this together, and I got other people under contract. I also have an idea for tomorrow night that ought to flip that crowd on its ear, but I need you to set it up for me.
I'm listening.
When Lance hung up, he was smiling. If he could get through the double cross he knew was on Rollins' mind, it would be a good night's work. He picked up the telephone book and thumbed the yellow pages for private security services. Everything was reduced to timing. He had to move along a set schedule of events and let nothing interfere with his movements. He parked his rental car in downtown Atlanta and waited by a bus stop. Not the nicest place in the world in the dark hours, and the form of Shigura Sato smiled as he saw the shadows moving in nearby doorways. No doubt they were considering whether that hulking shape was worth an attempted mugging. But he remained alone until the armored car pulled up to the bleh. But he remained alone until the armored car pulled up to the stop. They drove steadily to the sports arena. Sato left the vehicle at a back entrance to the building. Take it around front and wait for me there, he instructed the driver. Then to the four guards. You know what to do. 3 minutes before 10 o'clock, you four start down the aisle to the ring. Got it? Yes, sir. We'll be there. Sato went into the service entrance. No one around. He ran up 4 flights of stairs and went through a door that led to a catwalk running the length of the arena. The catwalk serviced lights and loudspeakers and crossed directly over the ring itself. Sato looked down on the sea of faces. Every seat was packed, and people were standing along the walls. Directly below him, the only man in the ring was the referee, but at that same moment the crowd broke into a roaring thunder of shouted voices. 2 men, very large in size and bulk, even from this distance and angle, were walking slowly from the dressing room to the ring. Sato looked for the rope. It was there. By damn, Rollins had kept his word. He'd prepared the heavy rope just as he'd been asked, coiled neatly on the catwalk. Sato squatted and studied the rope very carefully. Good. It would hold at least 1,000 pounds without being strained. But he still didn't trust Rollins, who had to be under heavy fire from his wrestlers to lower the boom on this unknown and obviously lethal Shigura Sato. Sato stretched out his hand to grasp the line just short of where it hooked into a steel beam. He tugged slowly and steadily, and his eyes widened as the hook and eye began to bend. That son of a bitch! I would have fallen 40 feet straight down to that ring, and those 2 thugs just waiting for me to hit so they could swarm all over me and finish the job. Rollins, you just better kiss your ass goodbye. A fine, cold rage stayed with him as he released the hook and eye and secured the rope to another beam. He tugged tightly, nodded with satisfaction, then looked below. Both wrestlers were watching the aisle, waiting for his usual appearance as if they knew nothing of the rope. They wouldn't bother to turn unless they felt and heard his body crash helplessly into the mat. Shigura Sato dropped the rope to ring center, and without a moment's hesitation was off the catwalk and dropping down. No careful descent here. No worry about the skin burns as the ManFac hands scraped down the rope. He landed with a thundering crash. Two men turned to face the helpless man they were expecting, and had no time to react as an enraged Japanese charged them with murder in his eyes. Sato struck the first man, a large bearded wrestler with red hair, square in his forehead with his right fist. Instantly, his left hand gripped a fistful of red hair to jerk the man forward and down, and then Sato had him in both hands, one gripping his hair and the other squeezing his neck, and Sato placed his mouth over the wrestler's ear and roared. Wow, that's mean. The ManFac amplified sound tore through the man's body, tore ear tissues, and ruptured the eardrum. The ManFac amplified sound. Oh, I just read that. The wrestler staggered in a semicircle as he cupped his hands to his ear, trying to stem the flow of blood and yellow fluid. Sato moved to his side with unexpected speed, grasped hair again, and threw the man from the ring. He fell heavily to concrete, still holding his ear. Sato turned and saw 500 pounds of trouble coming straight at him. Rollins' trump card. A sumo wrestler from Japan, one of those giants with flab covering his body and steel muscles beneath. A man who had wrestled and trained from the first days he could walk. He had matched his decades of experience with grappling styles for his new audience, and he was a mixture of rhino mass and ballet dexterity. I've got to take him fast, or I'm in trouble. Don't wrestle this man, and don't let him wrestle you. Cripple him. Now. The great Buddha-like figure moved with measured speed toward him, arms outstretched but lower than the usual wrestler's reach. Sato waited until the last possible moment and stepped into those arms, aimed carefully, and drove a steel-booted toe as hard as he could kick into the left kneecap of his opponent. It was quick, dirty, and, most of all, effective. The kneecap cracked like a walnut shell struck with a hammer. Sato had an overwhelming sense of danger, an almost frantic need to get this over with at once, and the danger wasn't from within these four ropes, but outside. The great sumo wrestler's leg collapsed beneath him, and Sato spun around behind the other man and brought both ManFac hands together in a devastating double blow against his ears. Ugh! He is not fighting kind. He is fighting effective, but Jesus, you don't. I mean, you do. If you want to disable someone, that is very much what you do. The air pressure alone was enough to render the man dizzy, if you didn't burst both his eardrums. Big if. You already did it to one guy, and possibly rattled his brain. For a long and precious moment the wrestler remained where he was, one knee to the mat, striving to regain his footing to face his enemy. Sato gave him no chance. He came in again, both hands wide from his body, thumbs stiffened like small clubs, and brought them together into each side of the man's neck. He collapsed and fell backward slowly. Make it look good, and when it's over you'd better move it, friend. Lance acknowledged his inner voice. The ManFac body went high into the air and came down with thundering force, elbow across the exposed throat. 500 pounds twitched helplessly beneath him. Sato looked up at the stunned referee.
Count him, you bastard!
He roared. Goldsboro hesitated only a moment, then dropped down, and his hand slammed the mat 3 times. The crowd roar was insane. Sato was on his feet immediately. He went to the ringside, where he saw a white-faced Rollins staring up at him. Too many big bodies all about Rollins for this not to be a setup. Sato grasped the top rope and tore it in half. Rollins' eyes widened with sudden fear. Sato stepped over the lower ropes and dropped heavily to the floor directly before Rollins, one ManFac foot crashing onto Rollins's shoe. He couldn't cry out as the breath burst from him. Sato's hand shot out and yanked the package from Rollins' frozen hands. Then Sato spun about and ran heavily along the first aisle, brushing aside spectators and guards like wobbly tenpins. Whatever you do, don't stop, baby. Keep it moving. He nodded to himself as he ran. They'd expect him to go straight for the armored car, and he knew they'd bushwhack him before he reached it. Instead, he ran along the aisle to an emergency fire exit, crashed like a maddened buffalo through the doors into the night air. He ran with feet thundering into the ground into the parking lot, where his rental car was waiting. He roared off, turned away from the exit, and bounced onto a grassy area, the car skidding and fishtailing as he went, as he kept the accelerator down. He made it to the service road, forced himself to reduce his He made it to the service road, forced himself to reduce his speed to the legal limit, took the first road that ran off into an industrial park, and rolled toward the interstate ramp. The rental car vanished within the streams of headlights as he drove into Atlanta. He eased into the parking lot of a motel, switched to another rental car he'd left there for this purpose, and was gone again, taking turns through a housing development. No one could have followed him now without becoming obvious about the move. He returned to the interstate, cut off 2 exits later, and drove into the garage where the truck was parked safely. He parked a floor lower, walked up the ramp to the truck, and disappeared inside. He had paid the parking fee for a month ahead of time, and the attendants paid little attention to the truck coming and going. 30 minutes after he entered the truck, Otto Heller was in the driver's seat and rolling carefully down the winding ramp to street level. 7 blocks later, the truck was on the interstate again. Shigura Sato and Sven Andersson were locked securely within their servicing compartments. 20 minutes later, Otto Heller, dressed comfortably in slacks and a windbreaker, was on the open road and heading for Florida. Grinning like a kid who'd stolen the cookies, jar and all. And that is where we will leave you for this week. Yes, that is where we will leave you for this week. There's another book break here. I think there's 5 books. Or are there only 4? Maybe there's only 4. Anyway, that will about do it. I know, kind of a shorter one this week, but that's okay. It's a short act. We now get into what I believe is the final act, book 4 of ManFac. Goofy and charming as it is. And, a relic of its era, that era being the early 80s. Anyway, that'll do it. Hopefully people enjoyed. Again, sorry to all the people who who tried tuning in via Twitch last week and it wasn't working. That issue has since been resolved. Even though maybe it probably shouldn't have been, but whatever. At least not the way I did it. I think you could have made arguments either way. At any rate, with that, I'm going to call it. Later this week, we've got more reading from Bear v. Shark, the novel by Chris Batchelder. Possibly the last installment, though I may have to split it into 2, depending. Yeah, I'll probably have to split it into 2, even though it reads quickly. And then on Friday, we have some more of the Jesus incident. I believe it'll be our penultimate, second to last, installment of that. We'll find out. It should be. I think I've got the pages spaced out adequately to accomplish that particular feat. As always, I do reading every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, streaming live at about 12. I try to start at about 12 noon, U.S. East Coast time, but lately I've been like 15 minutes to half an hour late, for reasons. I will endeavor to prevent that from being the case going forward, um, and be a bit more rigid at starting at noon. Um, U.S. East Coast or Eastern Standard Time, Eastern Daily Time, whatever it winds up being, depending on the solstice, so to speak. Um, so yeah, you can tune in live or just listen to them after the fact. I update my playlists on YouTube every month or so, um, so those are become more organized. I am probably going to shift. I can't remember. Did I make the? Where's my playlists for the Southern Reach trilogy? Did I make the Southern Reach trilogy all one playlist? Or did I make that three separate playlists? I made it all one playlist. Okay. And I did the same for Rifters. I will. Oh, and I have them as separate playlists as well. Okay. That's fine. I can work with that. I will keep doing that. Once I get the trilogy all read through, and the same goes for what's it called? Remembrance of Earth's Past trilogy, the three body trilogy by Xi Liu. I will endeavor to make those their own playlists so people can take those and soup to nuts them. Yeah, I'll probably call it Destination Void slash Pandora Sequence trilogies. That's what I'll do. Yeah. Yeah. Up until that point in time, I'll make it so that I'll have each book have its own playlist, and then I'll combine them together. Anyway, that will do it. All right, cool. I know this book's a little it's a little trashy, but it's fun. Um, I have fun. Hopefully, other people are enjoying it as well. If you're not, well, don't worry. We'll get around to something more intellectually fulfilling eventually. Probably after I finish with Bear v Shark, I'll do another Greg Egan novel. Probably Permutation City. Yeah, I'll probably do Permutation City, which is not quite as grand scale as Quarantine wound up being, but it's still like there's some cool ideas in there. Anyway, until next time, stay safe, stay sane, and be decent to each other. If you're an Amerikanski this Thursday, enjoy as stress free a Thanksgiving period as you can. Um, Feel free to do your best to relax, even though it's arguably one of the most stressful times of the year. Um, and yeah, and I'd probably ask you not to get involved in the Black Friday and Cyber Monday shenanigans, but there's not much point of that, is there? That's going to be a zoo no matter what. Anyway, until next time, toodaloo, toodles, goodbye.